What's happening, folks? I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. So just when you thought that money in American politics couldn't get any more out of control, today the Supreme Court doubled down on the notion of money equaling free speech. This morning, the court ruled in the case of McCutcheon versus the FEC that individuals can donate money to as many candidates as their little hearts desire. Before this ruling, individuals could only contribute just over $123,000 to candidates, parties, or political action committees per election cycle. Today, that limit was completely abolished, although the individual donation limit to a single candidate remains still at $2,600. This ruling, along with the 2010 Citizens United decision, which abolished campaign contributions limits for corporations, has now solidified a political system completely indebted to the rich and powerful. So just in case there was still any lingering doubts that Washington is run on legalized bribery, today was just a nice friendly reminder from the highest court in the land. Now let's break the set.
It was a terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make up for it.
And once again, we put something on the air that's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait, do not answer that.
I want you to watch what we're about to do because you've never seen anything like this on television.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. My simple mission is to change the globe. I'ma do it with this passion and fire and tone. These words are hard hitting, you watching your neck, but you need to tune in because we're breaking the set. Breaking the set. Breaking the set.
General Motors is synonymous with the word bailout, and rightfully so, considering that U.S. taxpayers spent $10.5 billion to save the car company when it went bankrupt in 2009. But over the last few days, we've learned that perhaps it's time that GM is associated with another word: criminality. See, just yesterday, a series of damning documents came out proving that over 10 years ago, GM became aware of a serious problem with the ignition switches on millions of cars. This malfunction led to engines being shut down and the disabling of power steering, power brakes, and even airbags. Despite this foreknowledge, these faulty switches have already been linked to at least 13 deaths. So why would GM officials knowingly approve of these potential death machines? Well, because a minuscule profit bump is a lot more important to the company than human lives. According to documents obtained by Reuters, the company would have only had to pay a mere 90 cents more per vehicle in order to make the change to a safe ignition switch. But according to GM CEO Mary Barra, that's all in the past. Listen to how she answered the question from Congressman Dean Heller.
If safety was not the highest priority in the past, is it fair to assume that GM only acts in the best interest of GM at all times? Was that true in 2006?
Again, that's a very broad statement. I would say that there's been times in the past where there's been a safety focus. General Motors is a 100-year-old company, but I can tell you now from post-bankruptcy, there is a focus on the customer.
Only one problem there, Mary. It took nearly 5 years after GM's bankruptcy to recall the 2.6 million vehicles related to the ignition problem that your company knew about as early as 2001. And as far as recalls go, well, this has been a banner year for GM. Everything from power steering problems to faulty side airbag wiring has led to nearly 7 million vehicle recalls in just the first 3 months of this year. That's equal to 72% of all the vehicles GM produced last year. So once again, an unregulated free market has shown it will completely screw consumers and even facilitate their deaths if it means making an extra buck. So what's the solution? Well, according to former presidential candidate Ralph Nader, who's been taking on the auto industry over safety issues for decades, there's great potential for legislative reform to strengthen the antiquated motor vehicle and highway safety laws, bring them up to date, improve the recall authority, enlarge the fines, and increase the budget of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which is absurdly low, deliberately low. Nader couldn't be more spot on here. In fact, the 2014 budget for vehicle safety regulation is a pathetic $148 million. Unfortunately, the American people paid a cool $10 billion to save a criminally negligent company. Too bad the bailout didn't come with a disclaimer that the government pinches pennies when it comes to making sure you won't become another market casualty. Last week, the student government at Loyola University Chicago passed legislation calling on the school to divest from companies that are benefiting off of Israel's occupation of Palestine. This made the school the first Jesuit university to contribute to the boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS, movement sweeping across the globe. According to the official BDS website, the divestment movement focuses on, quote, targeting corporations complicit in the violation of Palestinian rights and ensuring that the likes of university investment portfolios and pension funds are not used to finance such companies. However, students at the University of Michigan have not had the same luck when their case for divestment was shut down by the central student government. Earlier, I spoke with the co-chair of a Palestinian rights group called Students Allied for Freedom and Equality at the university, Suha Najjar, to talk about the struggle to pass divestment. I first asked her what the student government did to block the resolution.
So normally these student government meetings only have about like 10 to 15 students who come and watch them. So for this meeting, which was held on March 18th, the day they were supposed to vote on the resolution, almost 300 people in support of the resolution came out. So they had to move it to a different room, into the largest room basically on campus, which is the ballroom. And they set up like this red tape between the student government and then everyone behind in support of the resolution. And so what they ended up doing, before the authors could even propose the resolution during the second reading, some member of the student government made a motion to indefinitely postpone the resolution, which would mean that they would just not even discuss it, and we weren't allowed to bring it up again to the student government. It would be tabled indefinitely. And so when they did that, when they made the motion, they had a little bit of debate between the student government, and then finally voted in favor of tabling it. And that's when we broke out into chants saying divest until we cleared the room.
One of the opponents of your legislation on the student government, of course, during the breakthrough sessions, was saying that rather than have the universities get involved in international politics, we should let John Kerry and Obama be trusted to solve the crisis in Palestine. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I think that was one of many comments. There was also a comment about us not being the United Nations, and I think the response is that these negotiations are a failure, and they're a failure because it's the players on the table. First of all, I mean, you have this racist Israeli government and this illegitimate Palestinian Authority negotiating on settlements and negotiating on issues that they're not coming up with any sort of they're not appealing to any of the people. I mean, both have their separate interests, and these are not the interests of the Palestinian people. It's not a grassroots movement. I mean, you don't see any discussion with these negotiations about there being an end to the siege. You don't see any discussion about freeing the Palestinian political prisoners. You don't see any discussion about one person, one vote within these negotiations. So they're kind of, they're a failure, and the people feel that way. So, right. You know, as Miko Peled said, there's a global intifada going on, and it is this BDS movement, and this is why students on campuses everywhere are a part of this global intifada, because it needs to be something that's more grassroots.
Right, and of course I can't help but bring up this. The chair by boycott, divestment, and sanctions at SAFE was recently the target of an article in the Washington Free Beacon. Can you explain what the controversy was over an old Facebook photo of him holding a pineapple or wearing a keffiyeh?
Right. So the student is Yazan, and he's a member of our is a member of SAFE. He's actually the BDS chair, and so this photo was, I think he posted it about almost a year ago, and it was a basketball game. You know, we have here these basketball tournaments between some Arab students, and they called themselves Team NNS, which is Team Pineapple, and that picture he uploaded it a while ago, way before any of this, and he was sort of wearing a keffiyeh around his face, and he had a knife, and he was sort of stabbing the pineapple, saying that they were going to lose. It was all good, humor. And then, when this happened, all of a sudden his photo is on the Washington Free Beacon with this analysis of the pineapple representing some sort of him stabbing the pineapple with some sort of anti-Semitic notion, I guess, or whatnot, which is completely ridiculous. And this is not the first time that we've been slandered. We were actually slandered publicly within the meeting, the resolution meeting on Tuesday. Claims that we've been threatening, we've been issuing hate, and it was very clear. Even there were statements made by the administration saying that we were actually nonviolent, very peaceful, and we're doing student activism is something that the university should be proud of, and it's something that the vice president was proud of as well.
Briefly talk about how you became an activist on Palestine.
Yeah, so I'm actually from the Gaza Strip. Originally, I'm a refugee in the Gaza Strip, and then also a refugee out of the Gaza Strip. So, so I guess like twice removed. And so, you know, I've lived in the United States my entire life, and I go to the Gaza Strip frequently on visits. And because I'm from the Gaza Strip and I have an ID, a Hawiyah from there, I'm not allowed to go anywhere within the West Bank, and I'm not allowed to go into what's now Israel proper. And so I think that growing up, hearing about, and which was what my piece was about, hearing about students who are just because, you know, they're Jewish or they have a grandparent who's Jewish, they can get these free trips to go anywhere they want within Palestine, occupied Palestine, was very frustrating for me, and it was something that I think, you know, at this university specifically, you walk everywhere and you see these flyers of like, you know, free trips to Israel. It was something that was very triggering for me, something very difficult. And also my visits to the Gaza Strip and seeing firsthand, I've lost like tens of family members and tens of friends in Cast-Led, in Operation Defensive Shield, even a long time ago during Intifadas. All my uncles have been shot. My father was a prisoner at one point. And I think that sort of, you know, being here, being in the United States, knowing that I could be involved in a movement like BDS that can actually, you know, that I feel is actually something that can make change and progress for Palestine, is something that actually leads me to be an activist, and I feel like it's my moral obligation to do so.
What are the next steps SAFE is going to take to push the demands at the school? And let's talk about BDS as a whole. I mean, although it's growing, it still seems like it's viewed as taboo. What do you think it's going to take to get a mainstream international level on this movement?
I really honestly believe it comes from places like campuses. I think student activism is extremely important, and I can only, you know, look at what happened during South African apartheid, and this is something that we stress a lot we try to stress a lot with our student government, is that it began here, and it was the push from students, it was the push from the grassroots level that created that change and made buzz around certain words like divestment, and it's the same for BDS. In terms of what we're planning to do next is, you know, ultimately the goal is to get our university itself to divest, or to create this ad hoc committee. You know, these student governments are sort of like representative of the student body support to push their universities to actually divest. So we made it very clear during our meeting, which is the last statement that I said before I walked out, is that the next step is the regents. And we're going to go to our regent meetings every week, and we're going to push our regents who have the final say, who can make those decisions. And we're going to go every single time they're here. They have meetings once a month that they hold at the university, and we're going to push for that, and we're going to fill the room and demand that they divest from these companies.
Suha Najjar, Students Allied for Freedom and Equality at the University of Michigan.
Thank you.
Stay tuned for a breakdown of BP's latest oil spill in Lake Michigan.
What are your thoughts on what's been going on in Washington?
Well, it's a mess, Larry. I mean, the whole country is being scoffed at and laughed at.
Enough is enough.
The media, the candidates, the corporatocracy, covering issues that actually affect you and me doesn't do too much for ad revenue.
Biotech agriculture giant takes on a 76-year-old American farmer based in Indiana.
How much fallout do you think this is going to create for the CIA? Do you think this is what's triggering the crisis?
America's the largest economy in the world. It's also the largest debtor nation in the history of the world.
Breaking the Set is mostly about alternatives to the status quo, but one that gave real alternatives a voice.
One minute they were working toward the American dream, the next they were just trying to survive the night. It's time for Americans and lawmakers in Washington to wake up and start talking about the real causes of poverty in America. With
With the non-stop coverage of the missing Malaysian airliner for the fourth week in a row, you may have missed an important anniversary over the weekend. 41 years ago, on March 29, 1973, the U.S. withdrew its remaining troops from South Vietnam, declaring the end of the U.S. military's, quote, direct involvement in the country. By that point, American troops had already been in Vietnam for 8 years, making it the longest and most pointless military conflict in U.S. history up until that time. The fact that the draft was implemented, which forced hundreds of thousands of soldiers to serve in Vietnam, caused widespread backlash across the states as average Americans began to question why they were sending their loved ones to fight communism. And the resistance to the war only multiplied as more young men came home in body bags. According to the National Archives, over 58,000 U.S. soldiers lost their lives. However, that number is dwarfed in comparison to the number of Vietnamese and Indo-Chinese civilians who tragically died during the war. According to Nick Terse, author of the book Kill Anything That Moves, The Real American War in Vietnam, at least 2 million civilians were killed, with over 5 million left wounded. Not to mention the millions of people who were exposed to deadly Agent Orange, or the tens of thousands that have either died or been maimed by unexploded mines in the following decades. And for what? Well, those who lived during the Cold War remember the threat of nuclear annihilation, along with the government's persistence that it needed to militarily intervene in any potential Soviet client states to stop the looming Red Menace. But unsurprisingly, communism didn't take over the world, even after North Vietnam maintained communist rule. And the domino effect anti-communist rhetoric used as the pretext to invade Vietnam turned out to be one giant sham. And even though tens of thousands of American lives were lost in vain, it has not prevented the military-industrial complex from ruthlessly embarking on similar catastrophic imperialist adventures based on known falsehoods. Take Iraq, for example, where fabricated WMDs were used as a pretext to occupy the country for over a decade. And just like Vietnam, countless civilians have needlessly lost their lives in another misdirected war. The pointless nature of these bloody conflicts creates a wallowing despair for returning veterans. According to the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, a vet kills him or herself every 65 minutes. That means that 1,892 soldiers have already taken their own lives in just the first 3 months of this year. But it turns out that the U.S. has learned at least one thing from its failed past interventions. Wars should be private, not public, because the draft isn't good for business, which is why unaccountable private military contractors are now more prominent than ever. In Iraq, although troops have been forced out, private contractors remain on the ground to deal with the burgeoning threat of Islamic radicalism. In Afghanistan, there are at least 1.6 contractors in the country to every 1 soldier, so many that the Pentagon can't even account for what they're actually doing there. So, as the military-industrial complex uses the mistakes from Vietnam to wage war more covertly amidst a new Cold War-era mindset, we can't let the lessons of Vietnam get lost. Because no matter what pretext is given, military aggression is rarely justified, democracy cannot be delivered, and freedom won't ever come at the barrel of a gun. Every year, billions of gallons of crude and refined oil are moved all across the U.S. But not all of that oil arrives safely to its destination. According to the government's own estimates, as many as 20,000 oil spills are reported each year. Needless to say, not all spills are the magnitude of the Deepwater Horizon accident, meaning that they don't always make headlines. But so far this year, I've already covered accidents involving spilled fossil fuels in West Virginia and North Carolina. But another spill that just happened last month in Indiana has certainly caught my attention. Not only because over 1,000 gallons of oil was spilled from a BP refinery, but because the oil in question made its way into Lake Michigan, a source of drinking water for 7 million people. Earlier, I spoke with Steve Horn of DSmogblog.com, and I first asked him to give us an overview of the spill.
Yeah, the Lake Michigan oil spill happened just about a week ago. It's still kind of unclear how much spilled, although the official estimate is just around 1,000 to 1,200 gallons at the highest level, maybe a lower level around 500. Just about a week later, BP has still not admitted exactly what kind of oil it is, although I think some governmental officials in the United States Coast Guard have said that it wasn't tar sands oil. I wrote an article that tried to explain that it's super unlikely that it's not tar sands oil. That's to say that it probably is tar sands oil, because the refinery next to Lake Michigan, in which the oil spilled, just got sort of retooled. It's called the BP modernization project for its Whiting refinery in Whiting, Indiana, right outside of Chicago. It got retooled to mostly refine tar sands. You know, it was 20% before, but as of December 2013, it's now about 85% of its capacity is used to refine tar sands. Plus, the pipeline that feeds that refinery for the main one is predominantly a tar sands pipeline from Alberta.
And of course, the Coast Guard said yesterday that it's not found any more oil in the lake following last week's spill. I mean, does this mean that the wildlife and ecosystem of Lake Michigan are totally free from harm?
No, in an earlier piece, I tried to point out that this is not unprecedented, just to talk about water impacts. This refinery is also churning out petroleum coke, or pet coke, which there's a lawsuit going on that the Attorney General of Illinois filed, Lisa Madigan, because pet coke is being spilled into the Calumet River, which is a tributary to Lake Michigan. So there's no evidence right now, really to say that the water is safe to drink, although they've said so. There hasn't been any independent water testing, so it's really murky what's going on in this area of Lake Michigan right now, although BP and the EPA and the United States Coast Guard have kind of given the A-OK. Given BP's track record, especially in the Gulf, I think it's kind of hard to take them at their word.
Right. I mean, it's hard to even take them when they say estimates, that it's not just extraordinarily conservative. Of course, as you point out in your article, that Lake Michigan is actually drinking water, the source of drinking water for 7 million people here. So it is a huge issue, and I hope that there's some testing soon, Steve.
Yeah, in that area alone of Chicago, it's source of drinking water for 7 million people, because it's such a huge lake. And it's a body of water that goes all the way from there all the way north. It's a source of drinking water for a lot more people than that overall. So it's really scary what's happening with this refinery. It's scary that unfortunately, with the Keystone XL debate, what's kind of been lost in it is this whole Enbridge pipeline system, for example, among other pipelines. So I mean, this is just a kind of a byproduct of the runaway expansion of the tar sands and its marketing to markets east, west, and south.
Of course, of course, the mainstream media has almost completely ignored this spill. BP's receiving strong words from Michigan and Illinois lawmakers demanding how is something like this going to happen. But Steve, is this rhetoric just hot air? Do you think there'll actually be tangible punitive action taken against BP finally?
Well, I really doubt it. Even this huge spill that happened last year, we'll just use a case study in Mayflower, Arkansas. I was kind of optimistic because there was this rhetoric just about a year ago with that spill, which tar sand spill for an Exxon pipeline, and then it ended up seeing that they're only charged several $1,000s, which is just basically pennies for big companies like BP and Exxon. So I'm not too optimistic about it. I'm not too optimistic that someone like Rahm Emanuel, who President Obama's former chief of staff, is going to do anything that really punishes corporations in a very serious way.
Right. I love how the punishment is just pay like an hour worth of what you guys make. It's like, all right, just a slap on the wrist. Here's an hour's worth of earnings. Let's move on and keep poisoning the world. I want to move on to another story, an energy story rather, that you've been covering closely. The 3 energy export congressional hearings held last week. What do you think the overall message of these hearings was?
Two main messages. Number one, the United States is basically, according to Congress, akin to the new Saudi Arabia, where it will become an energy exporting superpower, and it needs to be because of what's happening in the Ukraine and with Russia. That was message number one. Message number two was, basically just the next logical conclusion is drill, baby, drill, because to make that happen, it means more and more fracking has to happen, or more and more tar sands need to be extracted, et cetera. So those are the two big messages, all coming from politicians that essentially are bought off by those same companies that want that to happen, or staff members who formerly were lobbyists for.
And let's talk about some of those specific people that testified at the hearing. Can you briefly highlight who they are and what their connections are to the oil and gas industry?
Sure. We'll use one case study. We'll use David Goldwyn, who used to be the special envoy for international energy affairs for the State Department, which was just created a few years ago by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. David Goldwyn is now a consultant for the oil and gas industry. He does stuff for think tanks that are funded by the industry, such as the Brookings Institution. But on top of that, this rhetoric was about tyranny and dictatorships and how to wean off oil and gas from Putin, for example. And at the same time, David Goldwyn's, his track record is he was lobbying on behalf of the Gaddafi dictatorship in the 2000s, and he's also used to be a lobbyist on behalf of Turkmenistan. So we're talking about people who were witnesses that were called before the Energy and Natural Resources Committee of the Senate at the same time for this rationale of weaning oil and gas off of Russia, which, by the way, these two countries, the United States and Russia, are so interconnected with their oil and gas industries that it's mostly hot air anyway.
There's a huge problem and a huge disconnect because this rhetoric actually gets passed down to the American people who say that, we need to expand oil domestically so we can lessen our dependence on foreign oil. I mean, what's your response to that argument?
My answer would be that the entire dialogue is insane based on the realities of climate change and of ecological disasters that accompany all this drilling. So I would say we just need to have a completely different dialogue on a global level about what we're going to do if we want to see a planet that exists past 2100.
Well said. I think we'll end it there. Nothing else you can say about that, Steve. It definitely is a paradigm shift. Time to start addressing that. Steve Horn, writer, desmogblog.com. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
That's our show, you guys. Join me again tomorrow when I break the set all over again. And be sure to tune in to hear about the worldwide wave of action happening this weekend, where Occupy Wall Street folks are going to make a revival of activism all around the world. You don't want to miss it.
Yeah, I take no prisoners, you call it aggressive, but all I see is lies coming out in your message. I keep it audacious, speaking the facts. We break the paradigm with truth and tact. The people don't need to be fed propaganda, spoon-fed fabrications and slander. What we need is to question more and to keep
Political system completely indebted to the rich and powerful. So just in case there was still any lingering doubts that Washington is run on legalized bribery, today was just a nice friendly reminder from the highest court in the land. Now let's break the set.
It was a terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make up for it.
And once again, we put something on the air. It's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait, do not answer that.
I want you to watch what we're about to do because you've never seen anything like this on television.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. My simple mission is to change the globe. I'ma do it with this passion and fire untold. These words are hard hitting, watching you.
Human lives. According to documents obtained by Reuters, the company would have only had to pay a mere 90 cents more per vehicle in order to make the change to a safe ignition switch. But according to GM CEO Mary Barra, that's all in the past. Listen to how she answered the question from Congressman Dean Heller.
If safety was not the highest priority in the past, is it fair to assume that GM only acts in the best interest of GM at all times? Or was that true in 2006?
Again, that's a very broad statement. I would say that there's been times in the past where there's been a safety focus. General Motors is a 100-year-old company, but I can tell you now from post-bankruptcy, there is a focus on the customer.
Only one problem there, Mary. It took nearly 5 years after GM's bankruptcy to recall the 2.6 million vehicles related to the ignition problem that your company knew about as early. What's happening, folks? I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. So just when you thought that money in American politics couldn't get any more out of control, today the Supreme Court doubled down on the notion of money equaling free speech. This morning, the court ruled in the case of McCutcheon versus the FEC that individuals can donate money to as many candidates as their little hearts desire. Before this ruling, individuals could only contribute just over $123,000 to candidates, parties, or political action committees per election cycle. Today, that limit was completely abolished, although the individual donation limit to a single candidate remains still at $2,600. This ruling, along with the 2010 Citizens United decision, which abolished campaign contributions limits for corporations, has now solidified a General Motors is synonymous with the word bailout, and rightfully so, considering that U.S. taxpayers spent $10.5 billion to save the car company when it went bankrupt in 2009. But over the last few days, we've learned that perhaps it's time that GM is associated with another word: criminality. See, just yesterday, a series of damning documents came out proving that over 10 years ago, GM became aware of a serious problem with the ignition switches on millions of cars. This malfunction led to engines being shut down and the disabling of power steering, power brakes, and even airbags. Despite this foreknowledge, these faulty switches have already been linked to at least 13 deaths. So why would GM officials knowingly approve of these potential death machines? Well, because a minuscule profit bump is a lot more important to the company than as 2001. And as far as recalls go, well, this has been a banner year for GM. Everything from power steering problems to faulty side airbag wiring has led to nearly 7 million vehicle recalls in just the first 3 months of this year. That's equal to 72% of all the vehicles GM produced last year. So once again, an unregulated free market has shown it will completely screw consumers and even facilitate their deaths if it means making an extra buck. So what's the solution? Well, according to former presidential candidate Ralph Nader, who's been taking on the auto industry over safety issues for decades, there's great potential for legislative reform to strengthen the antiquated motor vehicle and highway safety laws, bring them up to date, improve the recall authority, enlarge the fines, and increase the budget of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which is absurdly low, deliberately low. Nader couldn't be more spot on.